So I want to cover two things tonight. The concept of elasticity, which is a measure of responsiveness of one variable to another. We usually think of the responsiveness of quantity of one particular good to either the price of that good changing or the price of other goods or to income or anything like that. So, generally elasticity is just a measure of responsiveness of one variable to another. It's a ratio between the two. And so there are four of them we're going to go through here: own price elasticity of demand, cross price elasticity of demand, income elasticity of demand, and own price elasticity of supply, though we won't spend too much time on that one. And I want to go through a short case of who pays the tariff before going through that. And then we're going to get into the area of economics called industrial organization, or looking at market structures. Now, I've tried to get rid of all of the massive amount of graphs in this section and moved away from efficiency concerns and things like that economists really love, but to focus in just on, what are these industries like? How does competition take place? What characterizes one industry from another? And so we can have an idea of kind of putting these categorizations out there. And that they're in some ways arbitrary categories, as all categories are, but they do have certain characteristics that go along with them. And I'll get into that when I get down to those particular things. So let's start out with this question about who pays the tariff. Whoops. Sorry about that. And so this is from an Economist article just last year. And if we're thinking of a good, like a tariff good, like a kayak, and it's you're thinking about who pays the tariff. When President Trump was putting in the tariffs, he was saying that, well, the foreign countries would pay the tariff, and there was a huge debate. A lot of economists came out and say, no, Americans pay the tariff. But it's not a difficult question, but it's a little bit complex question to figure out who actually ends up having the incidence of the tariff. So if we look at it legally, it's the importer who will pay the tariff. So the importing firm will be responsible when it comes into the U.S. of paying the tariff. But it might actually be, when we look at the incidence, in other words, who really ends up feeling the brunt of that tariff, it might be the producing firm, and it might be the end consumer, and it might be that importer. It all has to do with the elasticities of demand and supply. And so again, elasticity is a measure of responsiveness. So if you are one in which you don't have when there's a price change, you have a massive change in your response. Say you're a consumer, and when there's a minor price change, you really adjust how much the quantity you demanded, then a firm is going to have a hard time changing that price. And so they're going to absorb the cost of it. On the other hand, if, on the supply side, if a price change leads to a dramatic change in supply, then probably it's going to be the consumer that ends up paying for it. So it's kind of the relative responsiveness that consumers and producers have on this. So, if you're thinking about it, it may be that firm that is exporting the good will have to lower its prices that it's charging in order to absorb the cost. Or it might mean that the firm is going to pass this along to the consumer. So, that's what's going to determine who ends up really paying for this. It's not a simple answer. You have to sort of get into the demand and supply elasticities for the various firms and consumers involved. Now, what determines that demand for, how elastic the demand for kayaks is? Well, it's one, can you postpone those purchases? So is this a necessity? Well, if it is, then you're not going to be able to do it. If it's a luxury of some sort, you are probably going to be able to postpone it. And if there's alternative products out there, maybe kayaks from another source, or maybe you decide to do some other activity because the price of kayaks have gone up so much. So this is what we're going to be looking at, is how responsive things are and how that affects particular industries, and who ends up paying the cost of tariff, or who ends up paying the cost of price changes that take place. Okay, so the first concept is own price elasticity of demand. And this is a concept in which you take the percentage change in the quantity of a good over the percentage change in price. And so we're looking at when you change price. So in this case, we're looking at the independent variable being price and the dependent variable being quantity. Now, when you see supply and demand graphs, they flip that because that's how Alfred Marshall did it back in the 1870s. And so we're sort of stuck with that. And I think he was thinking of agricultural markets where you're bringing the agricultural product to market and the quantity is sort of brought in, and then the price adjusts to that. But we often think when we're thinking of people's responsiveness to thing, we're often thinking they're actually responding with their how much they're going to purchase based on the price that's out there. So in this case, we're looking at how much does quantity demanded change? What percentage change do you get when you have a percentage change in price, a particular percentage change in price? And that is a number. When it comes out to be 0, we call it infinitely inelastic, because what we're looking at is when you change the price, you get no change in the quantity demanded whatsoever. It means in that case, it's got to be something that you absolutely have, so you're not going to respond no matter what. You absolutely need that good. This is a reference point, obviously, for a good that's a large portion of somebody's budget, even if there's probably no such thing as infinitely inelastic, because eventually you just run out of cash to purchase the thing. But then if you have this number comes out to be infinite, then that's infinitely elastic, and that means you make a infinitesimal change in it, and then you get a huge change in quantity, a ridiculously crazy huge change in quantity. So that's also a reference point that's out there as an extreme. But we usually think if this number comes to be less than 1, and we do use absolute value in this because we usually assume that there's a negative relationship between the change in price and quantity. So if you raise price, you expect quantity to go down and vice versa. It's interesting if you measure these things and you don't get that, because then you have a different type of good that's out there than the one that we normally think about, or a different type of market that's out there. Inelastic is when this is, elastic is when this is greater than 1, and inelastic is when this is less than 1. And you can just think of a rubber band that, if you put a little bit of force and you get a big change in the rubber band, we say that's elastic. And if you, put a whole bunch of force on something and you get almost no movement, then that's an inelastic situation. And so that's how we think of it here. How responsive is it? And we just use the dividing line of less than 1 as is inelastic, because you're getting less of a percentage change in quantity from the percentage change in price. And if it's greater than 1, you're getting a bigger than change in quantity than you're getting in the change in price. Okay. Now, it's sometimes useful for people to think of the relationship between this and the slope of a curve. One thing is, in the real world, we probably don't have fixed, or rather constant slopes. We usually have differential slopes, and demand curves might have different shapes on that. We usually don't have a nice straight line out there, but sometimes it helps people to understand elasticity if they think that what happens along a demand curve. And the formula that we use, I'm not going to have you do too many calculations with this, because that's not really the purpose for what I'm getting at right now. There are 2 main ways. I went through them in the study guide. One is called arc elasticity, so elasticity between 2 points that are out there, a range of values that are in there. And then there's point elasticity that economists use when we're thinking about just a real minute change in something that's out there. So the formula that we get for this is 1 over the slope is times price over quantity. And just sort of looking at that equation for elasticity is, you'll notice that as we increase the quantity, okay, because it's on the bottom over there, then what you're looking at, this is as we're moving to the right in this graph, you're going to have a bigger quantity on the bottom. And so that's going to make this whole number go down. So one of the things that happens is as you increase the quantity, think about what a slope is. It's the rise over the run. So we're looking at the change in price over the change in quantity. And so as we increase the quantity, then what's going to happen is that we're going to get less and less overall elasticity. Okay, so we move from elastic at very low quantities to inelastic at very high quantities. This is just to tell you that over a straight line like that, that we're going to see us move from elastic to inelastic demand. Now, the other thing to point out is that different quantities are going to change our elasticity components. Different time periods will, all sorts of things will. So these estimates are not sort of fixed over all time. So when they come up with them for an industry or good, they're coming with one that's sort of an estimate, a rough estimate, and it's also one that might change over time and over different time frames that are out there. Now, a perfectly elastic demand, the one I described when you have a change in the price produces an incredibly large infinite change in the quantity demanded. That's a flat demand curve. And a perfectly inelastic demand, you can see when there's a change in price, there's no change in quantity. These are reference points just to have you understand a little bit about what's inelastic and what is elastic. And so you can think that as that curve flattens out, you're getting, at least for a particular point on that, you're getting a more elastic demand. So the flatter that is, the more responsive quantity is to price. Okay. Now, what are some estimated elasticities? Krugman put some of these out there. And so I'm just recreating some of the ones on page 141. And these are, if you look at gasoline, that's a really low elasticity there. So what that means is when they change price, at least in the short run, people have to still get to work. They still have plans that they have in place. And so you see them not changing their consumption behavior very much to a price change that's on that. Now, over time, they can change their patterns. They might get they might get cars that use less gasoline. They might decide to take public transportation. They might walk. They might do all sorts of things. And so as time goes by, they adjust to it. I mean, I'm old enough to have lived through the 1970s, and as the price of gasoline skyrocketed, you saw cars get much smaller, much more fuel efficient, and so you did see an adjustment process take place. Now, Krugman also talks a little bit about the difference between business airline travel and leisure airline travel. So if you're on a business trip and you got to be there on a certain day, I know that when I go to a conference, there's usually the major economics conference is over winter break, right in early January. And I need to be there at that time. And it's usually a 3-day period, and I have to be there during that time. It doesn't make any sense to fly to Philadelphia and get there 3 days later or anything like that. And so I have a pretty inelastic response to price changes. It's not crazy because I have a limited budget, but it's much more inelastic than if I'm planning a vacation during the summer where I have lots of possibilities in there. And so I'm much more price conscious for that leisure airline travel than I am for the business airline travel. And this is reflected in those numbers where we have a 0.8 elasticity and then a 1.5 elasticity for leisure airline travel and 0.8 for the business travel. And then for goods like Coke and Pepsi, where there are lots of alternatives and those sorts of things, people are very price conscious. That's a 3.3. That's a very high elasticity on that. So that's looking at actual real world elasticities that are out there. Now, what determines this? What makes one good elastic and another good not so elastic on that in their demand or own price elasticity of demand? And so one is, are there close available alternatives? Are there substitutes for this? And so the picture, you see a surgeon working on someone, and if you need a medical procedure that's going to save your life, often people are very inelastic towards price, and they'll do it, again, within reason, because they have to be able to afford it, and or they use their medical insurance, but they'll be pretty inelastic to the prices of that are out there. Because there's no close substitutes for that. Now, if there's a lot of competition, you're going to go to different surgeons, then maybe they are a little bit more on that. And again, the second one is related to that, the proportion of income of this good. I mean, if it's a huge good in your budget, and the price of it changes dramatically, then you're going to have a hard time. You're going to have a hard time adjusting to that. So you're going to have to be a little bit more ready to make a change based on that, just simply because you won't be able to afford it. That's taking place on. And then luxuries versus necessities. This is also looking at what you have there. But if we're looking at the change in the price of that gasoline, you're going to have to make the same, you're going to have to still get to work. On the other hand, if you're thinking about buying an RV, then that's a luxury, and you don't necessarily need it. And so you're going to be much more price conscious there. And then obviously time elapse makes a difference, because you can make changes in your behavior, changes in how you do things over time, and you might be able to find alternatives over time. So usually elasticities go up over a longer time frame that's out there. Okay. We do have other elasticities. One of them is called cross-price elasticity. So you have the same formula, except for we're looking at the quantity change of X over the price change of Y. So it's between two goods. And this is one in which you can sort of tell by this number whether something is a substitute or a complement. I always think it's interesting when we think about the ski areas in Colorado. They're in some ways, they are substitutes, because on any given day you're only probably going to ski at one or the other, but they keep putting passes where they give you, if you're season pass this one, you can get usage of the other a couple times, or sometimes you can get, for places like A Basin, you can get a pass to a whole bunch of ski areas. So at that point, are they substitutes or complements? It's kind of difficult on that. Well, what you would do is you try to go out and measure actual changes in quantity based on the price change in the other. And if this comes out to be greater than 0, then there's substitutes, because then what you're looking at is that when the price of one goes up, you're looking at the quantity of the other going up. So you're essentially switching on that. And then if it's less than 0, then they're complements. So this would become an empirical question on this. And I do think it's sort of interesting. There are lots of things like this where things have qualities that are either a substitute or a complement, and they'll have qualities of each that are out there. So, and then if it comes out to be 0, it's unrelated on that. So that's cross-price elasticity. So we've gone through 2 now: own price elasticity and cross-price elasticity. And this is a lot of definitional material, but the concepts are important in understanding how markets and particular products and services work in those markets. And then there's income elasticity of demand, and we have ramen noodles up there. And this is sort of, how is your quantity going to change as your income changes? And so we think for most goods out there, this is a positive relationship. If your income goes up, you're going to increase the quantity that's out there. The reason I have ramen noodles in there is that when I was in college, I didn't even really buy the Mauritian ramen noodles, because I think they were like 8 for $1, and there was a knockoff that was 13 for $1, and this was the cheapest possible thing you could ever eat. And then when my income got reasonably good, I never touched them again, and I don't think I've had ramen noodles since on that. So that's one in which I would call it an inferior good, that as my income went up, we saw the quantity demanded actually go down, and it was less than 0 there. Sometimes Krugman separates out normal goods into inelastic normal goods and elastic normal goods. Inelastic means that it's positive, but less than 1, and elastic means it's positive and greater than 1. I think probably more clarifying is to when it gets above 1 to call it a superior good, or sometimes it's called a luxury good. It's one in which your income goes up, that you start consuming a higher proportion of this particular good that's out there. And so, it's something that sort of see if something is a high income good that's out there, something that people, when their income goes up, they consume more of it. I do know when we're looking at a lot of developing countries now, meat consumption is a superior good, and as their incomes have dramatically risen, they're eating lots more meat. I know that was true in China, lots more chicken than they had previously on that. So that's income elasticity of demand. Okay. And then there's own price elasticity of supply, and we just do what we did with own price elasticity of demand, but it's on the supply side. It's how responsive is the quantity supplied to a change in the price of a good. And again, you can get the same sort of diagram where a perfectly elastic supply is horizontal and a perfectly inelastic supply is vertical. Again, these are reference points for trying to understand the elasticity that's out there. So now, what are the determinants of price elasticity of supply? We went through them for demand, but on the supply side, one of them is time, because you can make lots of adjustments over time. Availability of production substitutes. So in other words, if you can use your resources to produce something else, then that's going to make you more elastic to supply. You're going to switch away from that. Perishability of the product. I put bananas up there because what you're looking at, if you produce these and you have a lot of quantity out there, you're going to very quickly lower the price, because you're looking at this is that I'm sort of flipping that, but it still works out that you don't want the quantity hanging around, so it's going to be very, very price responsive on this. Cost of inventory, same thing. You're going to produce a lot less that's out there. So if we're thinking about the perishability, I want to clarify that what you would do is, if it's very perishable and the price is very low, you're going to cut back on production a lot, because you want to make sure that whatever you have sells out there. And then can you substitute resources in this? That also makes a difference in the own price elasticity of supply. So, okay, well, that was elasticity. And now I want to switch over. And again, just to summarize on elasticity, a couple of quick points. One of them is it's just how responsive is one variable to another. So we're always looking at percentage change over percentage change. I think it's a really good concept to have in the abstract, not just in the specific. So I gave you a bunch of different elasticities up there, but I think the concept of elasticity is when you change this thing, how responsive is that thing over there? And that's really what we're thinking of. And we can do it with almost anything that we're looking at on that. But when we're thinking about markets, elasticity comes in all the time. It's actually kind of hard to calculate, because you're trying to do one variable versus another, and there are all sorts of different variables changing all the time, and so it's hard to really focus on that one thing that's out there. So there are studies done. What you really probably want is something very specific to your product and very specific to your market, and trying to understand things if you're thinking about whether or not you can change prices or not. The thing is, if you have, there is a link between elasticity and revenues. If you think about what revenue is, it's price times quantity. And so when you're thinking of raising prices, to get more money, the problem is that in most cases that'll decrease the quantity demanded. And the real question is the price increase going to compensate or more than compensate for the reduction in the quantity demanded that you're going to get? If it's not, you might actually result in less revenue. If it's, but if you have an inelastic demand in the range that you're looking at, then sometimes you can raise price and you can actually increase revenue on that. So that's how you sort of think about these things that are out there. Okay, market structures. Now there are 4 basic market structures. These are reference points. I often think that sometimes it's hard to put any particular industry in one of these, and particularly 2 of them seem extremes, like perfect competition. You can get near it. There are some very competitive industries out there, but it's hard to imagine an industry that has absolutely no barriers to entry, no things on that whatsoever. And then monopoly, that's at the other end of the extreme. And it's hard to imagine an industry that not only dominates by a single firm, but that there's no possibility of any other industry ever entering on that. And so I think probably these are extreme points on this. And we usually categorize most industries in the US as either oligopolistic, that's the big one, and that we're monopolistically competitive. Um, and um, uh, and so when we're thinking about this, think about these as reference points, and each of these has particular characteristics associated with them that matter for how you're going to conduct business. And so which one seems closer to what your particular industry looks like and feels like and acts like on that? I put pure chalk up there, and this is just sort of climbers chalk. Is there are just like hundreds of different climbers chalks, and I look at the ingredients, and the ingredients are almost exactly the same for all of them, but they have a completely, climbers will sometimes say that there's very big differences between them. They market them as if there's very big differences between them, but the chemical compositions are almost exactly the same for most of these. But what type of industry? Is that a competitive industry? Is that a monopolistically competitive industry? Are these all part of several different firms that are out there? This is when you want to figure out the character of an industry, then you want to get into it and try to find that out. Okay, so just sort of thinking about the different industries that we have and how they operate, I just want to start with an example. And this is from the Wall Street Journal. And this is just looking at, the situation where you're going to the store. I actually noticed this before this article, is that, fewer and fewer appliances require batteries, at least ones that you put in there. People have rechargeable batteries. There's ones that go into your computer, all sorts of things, but there's fewer of these batteries needed out there. So demand is falling, but prices are going up. Well, I mean, we've done supply and demand, and we would think, okay, well, maybe that's because there's a big increase in supply, but no, actually they're kind of cutting back on production over time. So what we have is this weird situation. What's doing this? So this is from the article. It says shoppers are paying more for disposable batteries, even though the proliferation of toys and consumer electronics powered by built-in rechargeable batteries has reduced demand. And so there's 2 major firms in this industry. There are two major products, and they're each associated with a firm. So it's kind of a duopoly. There's some others, but these are the big 2. Duracell from Procter & Gamble, and then Energizer from Edgewell, and they control about 3/4 of the market. So this is what we would call most likely an oligopolistic industry. It's not monopolized. There's not a single firm. There's just a couple of firms. And so what's going on is that this is a dying industry in some respects. And so they're no longer trying to gain market share. There's almost a truce that is formed between the 2. I won't go as far as to say collusion. Collusion sometimes does happen in oligopolistic markets, but it's a truce. They both see this is a declining industry. They're basically sharing the industry, and there's no reason to undercut each other on price. In an oligopolistic market, sometimes there's interdependent pricing. You sort of want to know what your competitor's doing, and you want to react to that in various ways. Sometimes there's a price leader. Sometimes there's a strategic game that takes place. Sometimes they collude. There's all sorts of things in oligopolistic markets. It's really the most complex market to analyze, and it's also the most prevalent that's out there. So they're no longer trying to gain market share, so they're really focused on current profits. So what they've done is they've raised price, and prices, in 2018 went up by 8.2%. And so both firms have moved beyond price competition. So what explains this is the oligopolistic structure of this market, that you really have two major competitors in this one. Okay. All right. So let's go through some of these market structures. And the things that are going to separate things out are barriers to entry. And this is how easy is it to enter or exit this industry? Are there very high fixed costs? Are there regulatory restrictions for entering? Okay, there's a number of other things, but is it hard to enter and exit? And there's always a debate over whether exit is important, but I think being able to exit easily makes it possible for firms to enter easily. If you can't exit easily, then you're going to think twice about entering on this. So in this one, that comes into play. And I put airplanes in there because, you know, it's like a 20-year span between the development of an airplane and when it reaches, you know, minimum efficient capacity. And this is an industry with extraordinarily high fixed costs. So it's hard to enter. And usually you enter because you also have access to government subsidies and a whole bunch of other things in there. So you don't really face new competitors very often. This is a very high industry with very high barriers to entry that are out there. Okay. Also, you know, how much of the market share? Are there a lot of producers in this one? It's not necessarily, you know, the dividing line is not necessarily the size of firms. It's sort of how many are there, and how much of the market do they control? Is this just a few firms, or is there a single firm that dominates this industry? So I have Google there. They're obviously a single firm that dominates an industry that's out there in one that's on there. Okay. And then there's also, do you have pricing ability? In other words, and what I mean, obviously firms can set prices, but are you going to lose all of the quantity demanded for your product if you raise prices that are out there? Do you have a very elastic, almost infinitely elastic demand? Perfectly competitive industries tend to have a perfectly elastic demand, and if they're not quite perfectly competitive, then they also have very, very high elasticity of demand. That's on that. So, you know, are you a price taker? In other words, do you have to set your prices in relationship to all the markets? Are you small enough that you're not able to affect all the prices out there? Or are you a price maker? That's what a monopolist is, where you can set the price for the industry because you're the only one in there. And you can actually raise prices and reduce quantity so you can raise prices, and you have that power within the industry that's out there. And then oligopolistic industries tend to have interdependent pricing, where you're using strategic behavior and other things like that in an industry, and you're really concerned with what your competitors are doing on this. Okay, so let's go to the next one. And then, you know, what are the goods like in this market? Are they standardized? You know, like sort of corn from local producers or something like that, where, you know, you go from one stand to another, and unless you know the people, the corn seems pretty much the same on there. Or is it a good that's distinguished by real or imagined differences that are significant to the consumer? So I have a Santa Cruz tall boy there. Mountain bikes, you know, they're differentiated. People like particular types of frames. Some fit them better. Some have different types of shocks that are out there. I always like the salsa shocks that are in there, on the shocks on the salsa bikes, because they're a little bit less soft, where the old ones were. There's you know, are these differences significant to the consumer that's out there? And so this is a dividing line between particular types of industry that are there. Is there product differentiation, or is there a standardized product? Krugman has a nice example sort of discussing a standardized product on page 205. So I hope you look at that. Okay, so let's go to perfect competition. So I have a peach stand out there. The product from one peach stand is in many cases indistinguishable from another peach stand that's out there, and this is, you know, a standardized product that's out there in a perfectly competitive industry. They're price takers. So if one peach stand is offering peaches for, $2 more than another peach stand, then you're probably going to go to the one that's cheaper, assuming that it's not, 6 miles away or something like that that's out there. There's pretty easy entry and exit. It doesn't take too much capital to open up one of these. I mean, so what you're looking at, this might not be free. I think the reference point for free entry that Perfect Competition has, it's difficult. But as a reference point, this gets pretty close to it. So we're looking at, three things: standardized product, price taker, easy entry and exit. And that's what characterizes that industry that's out there. Okay. Now, one thing I wanted to talk about in competitive markets, and I put, there's one of the dispensaries, Selma and Gunnison, is that just thinking about short run and long run equilibrium. The idea in a perfectly competitive market is, because there's easy entry and exit, a firm might in the short run be able to have above normal profits. We call those economic profits. I always think it's a little bit of a bizarre concept in that it's not a number that you see, because you have a reference point for what is the normal profit out there, and then can an industry have profits above that? That's what economic profits are. But if we're thinking about when these dispensaries opened, at first there were only a couple of them, and they were doing really well despite the very high taxes on the product and those sorts of things. But I think we're up to 7, or I think we're up to 8 now. I have to check that. But I think we're up to 8 now, and this is what happens in a market that has sort of above normal profits or economic profits, is you get entry into the industry. And so over time, it drives down those profits more towards the normal rate that's out there. And this is one of the things that happens in competitive markets. And so you'll read about what goes on in this when you read the wine example that Krugman has in his book. But this is an important concept, that if it's a reasonably competitive market and you have an industry that is making sort of super profits in it, that won't go on forever, because if there's reasonably easy entry, then firms will enter, and that'll start to drive profits down, okay, as they compete with each other more and more. And it's one of the principles of thinking about a competitive market that's out there. Okay, so the other extreme is monopoly, and this is a single firm or complete dominance in an industry. There's always a debate about whether something is a monopolist, and there was the antitrust cases in Europe over Windows and those sorts of things that are out there. And the thing about a monopolist is that they are a price maker, and so they can restrict quantity and raise prices and increase profits. Now they have, if it's a true monopolist, they have perfect barriers to entry. And I always think that's a little bit difficult, because even if there isn't a competitor, there's always probably a potential competitor. It's sometimes called contestable markets that are out there. But how do you get this? Krugman goes through this really well. Krugman and Wells go through this really well. You have control over a scarce resource of some sort. This is, I don't even know how scarce it is, but Krugman and Wells go through the diamond market in De Beers, which is the classic case of creating monopoly power that's out there. It might be an industry that is subject to large increasing returns to scale. This is when you get larger, you get more efficient. And I just mentioned earlier, this is really true of the airplane industry. There's, I think probably the most, if you had no restrictions, no international restrictions, no subsidy or anything, there's probably one airplane producer, because there's such high fixed costs and that takes place. But there's a lot of reasons why countries want to have their part in the airplane industry that's out there of various sorts. But it is an industry with very high increasing returns to scale that are out there. And I also put scope in there, because sometimes scope is when you increasing returns to scale, you get larger and you get efficiency gains. Returns to scope are when you do different things that are somewhat related, you get efficiency gains associated with that. But either one can lead to monopoly power on that. You might have technological superiority. And so you just have a new technology that's way ahead of everybody. You'd have to maintain control over that technology and keep it from spreading. And as we've seen with the talking about tariffs and the trade war, keeping technology safe is a pretty difficult thing to do. Now, the government can grant a monopoly in various ways through patents, through copyrights. A patent is when you suppose you introduce a new drug that you might have 20 years of non-competition, and then as soon as the patent runs out, then you get all these generics, and it moves pretty quickly from a monopolized market to a competitive market very quickly on that once that happens. You might be the Dutch East India Company and the British companies, they were granted monopolies for trading rights in certain areas of the world. And so they were given these exclusive domains over there. So that can happen too. So some monopoly is about government intervention on that. So you have sort of industries that tend towards it. Sometimes they're called natural monopolies, and then you have government rules that might create one that's out there. In fact, these government rules that created monopolies was what Adam Smith was railing against in the Wealth of Nations. And the last one is a network externality. And I think this one, when we're thinking about Microsoft, Krugman goes through this example, and I think you should read what he has to say about it. He explains it very well. But just, I think of this is something in which having something more prevalent out there makes it more likely that others will use a product. So what you're looking at here is part of the value of a product really comes from you can participate in a network that other people are using. So network externalities can be, suppose if you're thinking about electric cars, when there's a lot of people with electric cars, there might be more charging stations around. So it makes it more likely that you might want to do it. In the classic case of Windows, it was, offer the operating system fairly inexpensively, so that it's really prevalent out there, and then everything tied to it becomes developed related to that operating system that's out there. So don't make the money off the operating system, make it off of everything else that's out there. So that's it. That something being network externalities about something being used a lot by people, and so then it makes it other things possible that are tied to that. But read his explanation of a network externality. I think he does a good job of explaining it. It's out there. Okay, so that's monopoly. And again, are there real world monopolies? There's things that are pretty darn close to it that are out there. So the interesting thing about some monopolies, I always think of the near IBM monopoly that they had, that in the technological area, you make one wrong move and a monopoly kind of falls apart. So you zig when you should zag. So there's some interesting things associated with monopoly that are out there. Now, the real implications from monopoly, so this is the only diagram, so I'm not using very many in here, but this is just to sort of show you, they often come up with a reference point for what this would look like if it was a perfectly competitive market. And that's, the intersection of the supply curve, the demand curve for the product, and then the supply curve that would prevail in a perfectly competitive market. But what monopolists can do is they can raise the prices, since demand is not totally elastic, they have the possibility of raising prices and restricting quantity and still increasing the revenues and profits on that. And so in a lot of monopolized industries, what you see is decreased quantity, increased prices. This is so economists also focus on a lot of welfare losses from this, from a concept called consumer surplus and deadweight loss. But don't worry about that. That's just that they see some welfare losses from this. And some people argue that there's less technological change in an industry. I think that's both true and false. I think about all the technologies that were developed by Bell Labs, and that was a monopoly, but it was a regulated monopoly. And have we gotten as much technological change since it's been broken up? And that's debatable. It was a pretty amazing thing that since they were regulated, they developed these technologies, but they couldn't keep them couldn't keep total control over them, so they fueled a lot of other growth that's out there. So and they had the resources to do it because they were able to charge higher prices and stuff like that. So I don't know, it's tricky on that one. I think in most cases I'd probably prefer to see competitive industries. I think they probably do produce more technological change, but it's not as clear cut as it might seem at some point. So that's the implications from monopoly. Economists focus a lot on this. I think for our purposes, we just kind of want to understand what monopoly is and some of the things that they do. One of the things that a monopolist can do, because they face not a totally elastic demand, is that they can engage in something called price discrimination. And you know, this is where you can charge one consumer a different price than another consumer, and it's not really justified by the costs that are out there. I think the section that Krugman and Wells do on this is very good, I think, in explaining it. But the basic idea is you can think of just different prices for different tickets at different times, different routes, different time frames that people are setting. And so what you do is you try to hit all those different people, and they might have a different reservation price. And so if you can charge one person more than another, you can reap those profits that are out there. And so there's several cases in Krugman and Wells I think you should read in there that I've listed on here. But this idea is an important practice, and it's, you know, it's why you charge. You might have coupons, you might have all sorts of things that might have sales, and they're all about trying to capture consumer surplus. And we're not really covering that, but capturing this fact that different consumers might be willing to pay different prices that are out there. And if you change the price, you don't get total loss of quantity that's out there. Okay, so oligopoly, this is, when I think about this one, this is the most prevalent type of industry, which is unfortunate for economists in the sense that it's also the hardest one to characterize, the hardest one to figure out the pricing in it. There's a lot of strategic behavior. It just doesn't fit nice, neat little models quite as well. It fits a whole bunch of models that are out there. In fact, a lot of it can be described through game theory. There is a section in game theory in the book. You don't need to go through it, but when you end up having Dr. Hayes as your instructor, you should ask her to explain game theory to you. She teaches a whole class on it, and it's about strategic behavior and what the outcomes might be under different settings. But an oligopoly is where you usually have a few, usually large firms that have a high industry concentration. So I looked at at the mobile market, the wireless market, and you're looking at, you know, Verizon with about 36.5%, AT&T with about 32%. So right there, you got the two top in about 68, almost 70% just in those two, and then you add the third one in there, you're getting, you know, this is a very concentrated. There are only a few firms in this, and so usually this is because there's high barriers to entry, not quite as much or as limiting as monopoly, but it's hard to enter this industry. There's a lot of fixed costs that are out there. There's often interdependent pricing, that your pricing depends on what your competitors do. So there's sometimes price wars that take place. There's sometimes collusion between firms. There's sometimes one firm that takes the leadership on it. Sometimes you even get periods where there's almost no pricing because everybody's worried that if they change their prices, everybody else is going to change. So the idea is there's a lot of strategic behavior in this industry, okay, where you really have to know what your competitors are doing, because what you do is going to be really, the effects of it are going to be really felt when you do this. It can be differentiated or non-differentiated products and services. I think the real issue is the barriers to entry in this one that keeps it from getting all sorts of new firms. So is it more like monopoly? A little bit, but it's one in which you can get price wars in this one because it all depends on how things play out between the competitors on this. But it's really about industry concentration and barriers to entry on this. And then there's monopolistic competition. I think of the bike shops in Gunnison as a pretty good example of this. It's not that there's it's not that there's free entry and exit, but it doesn't take huge amounts of capital to open up a bike shop. You can do it. They have, but it's differentiated products. Usually, each of them specializes in a different set of their main mountain bikes that they have on that, and so they have some ability as a price maker. But if they're making too high profits, like Perfect Competition, there'll be more entrants in there. And we had one that was in the City Market shopping mall, and that one went out of business. But we have, if you think in the valley, we have quite a few bike shops in the valley. So it's one in which it's not impossible to open up. You have to kind of have a differentiated product on that, and so there's that sort of separates this industry. The big thing here is it's always about product differentiation. That's how you get it, and there's some good examples in Krugman and Wells on that. Okay, so that takes us through, and we've gone through elasticity and the various market structures. It's a lot of definitional information. What I really want you to get out of it is to think about, whatever product or service you're thinking about working in or on, think about what the market is like. Think about what are the characteristics of that market, and what are the characteristics of the good? Is it, how is it tied to income? How is it tied to other products? How responsive is it to price? And then think about the industry. Who are your main competitors? Is it just a few, or is it a whole bunch of them? Are there real barriers to entry? Is this pretty easy for someone to set up a business, not too costly, or is it nearly impossible? Do you need tremendous amounts of capital to start? Is it one in which you're primarily engaging in price competition, or is it one in which you're engaged in, you're really trying to separate out your product from others, and and those sorts of things. So think about those barriers to entry, type of pricing or type of good that it is, whether it's pricing or product differentiation, and then think, is it when there's a few competitors or a whole bunch that are in there, and think about those characteristics. That's really what we're after here. And I think you can understand the basics of this without getting into too many of the graphs. I think the graphs do serve a purpose. For economists, they're about talking about efficiency and talking about policy to correct some of these industries. As business owners, you're not really trying to correct an industry, you're trying to operate within it. And so you want to know the characteristics of it, and you want to know how things run in that industry, and how things operate in that. And that's what I hope this has gotten to you. And so I will see you guys later in the week. And there's a study guide to this where I put a table in there that kind of summarizes a lot of this. And I worked through a few examples of elasticity. I'm not going to have you do calculations. I'm more interested that you can interpret it. It's not that they're hard, but it's just kind of a sideline for what we're trying to get into right here. So take care.